Broadcasting from the beautiful Hill Country in Texas, this is OneRadioNetwork.com.
Hope you're feeling all right this morning. It is the 8th of February. Is that right? Yeah, February 8th. Yeah, February 8th, 2023. And this is a Wednesday morning. Generally, the first Wednesday brings us to the world of money, the real world of money, with Fred Dashevsky, good friend and the head guy there at U.S. Coin Capital. But we had a freeze apocalypse again last week, and so we had no heat or nothing. Never mind the internet. We didn't have any electricity. It was one of those days. After Fred here, we can only stay for about an hour with Fred, but he's got things to do. But then we're going to come right back, and we have lots to talk about. We're going to do some things with fasting that I thought would be fun and to clue you in on so you can take part. And so that's coming up in about an hour or so. Our phone number, if you care to join us, is 888-663-6386. Email Patrick at OneRadioNetwork.com. Fred Dashevsky is in Hilton Head, South Carolina. Fred is the head guy there at U.S. Coin Capital, former partner of Andrew Goss of the Real World of Money fame. And Fred, good morning. How are things there where you are? How's everything?
Good morning, Patrick. Things are wonderful here in South Carolina. I mean, I'm glad that the power situation has resolved itself out there in Texas.
Yeah. They got this thing called ERGOT. I don't know if you've heard of them.
Yes.
Yeah. Have you heard of them? Well,
it became famous. Was it last year?
2 years.
When you had that whole power grid go down 2 years ago?
2 years, yeah. But it's the same thing this year. I mean, they turned off our power for 12 hours, 15 hours. Nobody said why or anything.
It was the Chinese balloon.
That's right. It was the Chinese. Blame it on the Chinese. It was a Chinese balloon. Well,
Remax has launched its own, in response.
Oh, they're going to do their own? Yeah, I think they should. Fred takes care of U.S. Coin Capital, which is a company that rebooted then from their SDL with Andrew Goss, that he was partners with Andrew for 30 years, Fred, or so. And then now U.S. Coin Capital has renovated themselves, and they have a nice staff up there. And you all buy and sell gold coins for a living. That's what you do, you all.
We do.
That's what you do.
Constitutional U.S. issued government, real money.
Oh man, yeah, that's real stuff. You don't mess around for new people. Fred doesn't mess around with the gold bars and bricks and silver things because it's a whole other animal, isn't it? It
is. They used to be fairly similar. I mean, I'm a firm fan of anything physical better than paper money. So for those that do accumulate, any form of gold, and we generally refer to that side of the world as bullion.
Bullion.
And that includes the bars, the bricks, the ingots, and even some of the round coin-shaped items like the South African Krugerrand or the Canadian Maple Leaf. Although they are round and coin-shaped, they are actually technically bullion. And the only reason that they're separated is that the government treats them differently. So the bullion world is sort of incorporated as a commodity, the same way we deal with oil or frozen orange juice or anything like that. It's a regular commodity. So it falls under the regulatory issues of the federal government. So for those people that deal in it, let's say, for example, somebody wants to sell me a bar of gold. Federal law requires me to take that social security number from that party. I have to file a 1099-B with Internal Revenue that includes their name, address, social security number, and the amount of the check that I wrote to them. And because we're dealing in bullion, I am also required by federal law to file AML rules, anti-money laundering, which means that I have to somehow know my customer bought that gold with legal money. And if it turns out that was not the case, now I'm subject to criminal penalties because somehow they've deemed that I've facilitated in money laundering. So all this happens within the world of bullion. And people always say, well, I've bought bullion and no one's asked me anything. Well, it's when you sell it that they ask for that private information. And if a dealer does not ask for that, they're violating federal law. So I just found that looking at that, I'm sort of a person that's always believed in the sovereignty of American citizenry, and government interference should be as limited as possible. You know,
Hmm.
obviously they have technical terms and political terms for people who think the way I do, but I've always believed in limited government. Do the least amount possible to do the things government is supposed to do, but stay out of my life otherwise. And the U.S. coin market is free of all of these government regulations. So, someone can sell me $1 million worth of pre-1933 $20 gold coins. I write them a check, and that's the end of my obligation. If that person wishes to report a gain or loss, it's up to them. I'm not forced to require to file any federal government forms. Plus, the one thing that always separated the two products for me was the fixed supply of pre-1933 American gold coins. So not only are they made of gold, but they can never make any more of them. And I find that very interesting that the public can own something, a commodity, take delivery of it. Unlike oil that people invest in, no one gets barrels of oil shipped on a truck and dropped off in their backyard. You don't own physical barrels of oil. You can invest in it, but you own a paper contract. But with gold, you can actually own the physical entity itself. And if you do it in the pre-33 form, I just ship it to you. And again, that's where it ends as far as reporting. And since they can never make any more of them, not only can they grow in value because the underlying price of the metal they're made of is increasing, but as they get rarer, their value can also increase that way as well. So I think it's much more beneficial.
Now the mint they do mint just coins that are not numismatic, right? That are silver, don't they? I mean, you can buy like silver things from the mint, an ounce of silver.
They make what we call modern bullion coins. The most popular would be silver eagles or American gold eagles, and they are treated as bullion. So although they are coming from the U.S. Mint, it gets just a little bit confusing because they also sometimes carry denominations. Like the silver eagle says $1 on it, and the American gold eagle, which is a 1 ounce gold coin, says $50 on it. And people say, well, that means it's a legal currency. Well, technically, it was granted a different status than the original coins. It was granted this sort of status like, I've always said, like when they grant an actor, a doctorate from a college that he didn't actually earn, but they will refer to him as a doctor. Those sort of impartial statuses that they create. They did that for the bullion products. So the American Eagles are effectively a bullion product, even though they are minted for the U.S. government and they are in the coin shape.
What did they come up with the idea of a coin for $50, a gold coin? I don't know. Where did they come up with that number? Where did they come up with that?
It's kind of odd. The government's official price for gold was stuck at $35 or $37 an ounce, even though, of course, the actual price had gone up. Mm-hmm. But the government had never raised its official legal status price for gold, and somehow came up with the idea that in the modern world, the 1 ounce gold coin, should carry a $50 denomination. But then it gets strange. They made a half ounce coin that carries a $25, but then when they cut it down to a quarter, instead of being $12.50, it's $10. And then the 10th ounce coin is $5. So the math really didn't make a lot of sense. It was more like they were just assigning a name,
some kind of value for it,
randomly, as opposed to actually saying that this is any kind of status of value or a monetary number that has any kind of real consequence to it. Sort of an interesting quirk, but listen, this is your U.S. government at work. So
every couple of years, the story comes out, we should just do $1 trillion coin. Did you see it? It came out again a couple of weeks ago.
I've been talking about this since the 90s.
Like, it seems like so strange you would even contemplate something like I don't even get how that could even be talked about.
Well, the way it comes up is because there are little quirks within the legal laws as they're written. And, one of them technically suggests that it's possible for the U.S. Treasury to issue $1 trillion coin, let's say made out of platinum or something.
Whatever.
But every time the Treasury has talked about this or Treasury secretaries have referred to it, they've always kind of, laughed it off as a gimmick. Somebody had uncovered the, kind of the legal issue of suggesting that there was a way to suggest that the lawyers could line up and say, we have an authority here that's not being utilized, and technically we can create this trillion-dollar coin. And the old idea back when they first had come up with this back in the 90s, they were going to make one coin large enough to pay off all of the federal government debt, which in the late 90s, we were looking at maybe $5.5 trillion.
They were going to do one coin for $5.5 trillion.
Right, and then pay off the entire debt. But again, it was just a gimmick. I'm really kind of troubled by the idea that this is what we're looking at to resolve the problems that we have economically. Some sort of sleight of hand gimmick to come up with a financial resolution to a $32 trillion national debt problem. I think this is sort of nuts. But listen, I think the public should be a bit aggravated at Congress at this point for abrogating their responsibility to protect the public. We've allowed the government to run up debt that is so large right now that I honestly believe, and I'm saying this for the first time in my 40-year career, I don't believe there's any more political solutions left to solve the economic problems.
You just can't do it.
There are no options left. I don't think the president can provide a plan, any kind of economic issue that's going to reduce the government spending or deficits, that's ever going to actually be able to address the issue. We heard the State of the Union last night. For those that did listen to it, the State of the Union is strong, according to our president.
Yeah. Well.
But our fiscal situation is pathetic. We're $32 trillion in debt. We're paying $1.5 trillion in interest payments. And both Congress, Republicans and Democrats seem to agree at least on one thing, although it became kind of a joke and a little bit of a haphazard part of the speech, that they don't want to touch Social Security or Medicaid. So they're saying that $77 trillion deficit there, no one's going to bother to try to suggest that they're not going to make good on that. Somehow we're going to pay for that. And of course, we can't do that through revenue. There's no way we can raise $100 trillion in revenue in the next decade. That's the 30+ trillion in bonded debt and the $77 trillion hole between Social Security and Medicaid. We can't raise that $100 trillion in the next 10 years. We're going to have to print it.
Sure.
So I don't care what actions the government takes. I don't see any solution.
Where does that $77 trillion number come from?
Well, this gets really weird. Okay, so the government has debt in two forms. One they call bonded debt, and that's the actual bonds, treasury notes, and securities that have been physically issued from the U.S. Treasury that are in the hands of foreign investors, foreign governments, central banks, individual investors, mutual fund managers, pension account holders, and individual investors. These are the actual notes,
people that own these bonds,
of the U.S. government. That's the bonded debt. There's $31.6 or 7 trillion worth of those floating around that become due and payable that now we have to have the money to make good on in order not to default on those obligations. Now, I don't know if you remember this, but back in the 90s, when Robert Rubin was Secretary of Treasury, he took $3 trillion from Social Security that was actual money, real money, that was in that trust fund, segregated for the public to protect them so that the money that has been taken from their paycheck week after week since the first job they ever had was secured by trust by the federal government, not to be used or touched for any other purpose. Instead, Robert Rubin took all of that money and spent it, put it into the federal government budget, and utilized it to pay government expenses in that era, 1990s.
Well, I thought
not what we did.
Didn't Andrew teach us that, Fred, that back in LBJ they began taking the money out of the Social Security trust?
Little by little, but the massive amount of it happened during this period. It was mostly during the Clinton years. And, what happened as a result of this is we put these bonds out for 25, 30 years. And guess what? Now it's 30 years later and these bonds are coming due. And we don't have the money to pay it any more than we had then. We had a $5 trillion debt then. We have a $31.5 trillion debt now, and we're supposed to be paying these debt obligations back because somehow they figured 30 years ago, by now we would have figured out how to deal with this, or Congress would have addressed the issue, cut the deficits down, come up with a revenue spending program, reduce government spending, raise taxes, but done something to fill this gap. So what happens is we have the bonded debt. These are the bonds we've just talked about.
Right.
But beyond that, there are these unfunded liabilities. These are obligations that the government has. It already has locked in. And it's interesting, but we need to recognize also that when we talk about this debt ceiling problem, this is money already spent. We're not discussing the idea of government getting access to new money to pay for future spending. We're talking about a check that's been written, that's been put in the mail, that just hasn't hit the account yet. But it's coming down any day now. The mail is going to get delivered, and that check's going to come back against the account. We have unfunded liabilities in the United States just between two of the federal trust funds, Social Security and Medicare, that total $77 trillion. That's the hole that we've created. We've continued to spend the money that we take in from those accounts that's supposed to be in a trust and segregated, and we're spending it in the current era because the government is deficit spending, so it doesn't have enough revenue from its normal resources, so it's gone into the piggy bank, and it's stealing from the public. I can't believe that there is not more outrage from the general public about the fiduciary responsibilities of Congress and how they are not maintaining their obligations to the general public. So here we are now in 2023. The bonds that we issued back in the 1990s are coming due. We don't have the money. We've continued to add to this pile. And now we sit with, between the bond debt and the unfunded liabilities, well over 100 trillion. And that's just two of the government trust funds. There are 170 other government trust funds that are underfunded.
Boy, it doesn't sound good where we've found ourselves. And Fred Dashevsky's here. If you care to join us, 888-663-6386. And, even the 32, Fred, if you look at all the money that's been created and borrowed, for the last 5 or 6 years or so, I don't see that on the 32. What am I missing here? I mean,
it's growing quickly. So
yeah, but it wasn't growing very much. It's been like 29 or 30 for years. I didn't see it moving. And all this money with COVID and all this stuff, and I don't think that number could be accurate, could it? The 30.
Well, remember how they play this game right now. If the Federal Reserve steps in and buys up some of the obligations, well, temporarily it won't show up in the number because the Fed shifted it over to its own balance sheet.
Oh, but I don't understand.
So,
what I don't understand is, okay, what we were talking about is, so the part that I missed. So when the Treasury allows the Federal Reserve Bank of New York to monetize the debt, like let's just say, Fred, $1 billion, it goes on the Fed's balance sheet, right? And we can see that has gone up a lot. But they don't add that debt that they owe the Fed onto the bonded debt?
They do add it to the bonded debt because they'll look at the amount of bonds that they have outstanding.
Right.
But if the Fed purchases those bonds, then effectively they're off the books. So again, we can shift money around and play this shell game, take the P and move it from one place to another and pretend it doesn't exist. But we're not really eliminating any of these obligations. We're merely just changing the accounting numbers and, where it shows up on the ledger sheet. It's nonsense. The Fed intervening into the economy makes it appear sometimes as if the situation is far better than it is because you have this intervening entity taking trillions of dollars worth of obligations, from the accounting processes and kind of hiding it on their own balance sheet temporarily until they have to address it themselves. So, it's an interesting gimmick that they play, and it gets kind of complicated. But
Okay.
we're not advancing ourselves anyway. Remember, we've gone from $5.5 trillion in the late 90s to 30 trillion in the 2020s. In 10 years, at this rate, we're going to have $50 trillion worth of bonded debt floating around. And the problem is this obligation is shifting to where a large amount of the holding of this debt isn't in the U.S. anymore as much as it was 20, 30 years ago. It's shifted a lot more to foreign countries. China holds massive amounts of the U.S. government bonded debt. And, this is sort of a dangerous game to play because if we don't address the problem, inevitably we have to print so much money. And it forces interest rates to go up when the Fed intervenes in the selling the bonds. I mean, look, they're looking to sell about $35 billion worth of bonds today. And that's just current obligation debt. They're trying to raise money.
Just cash flow.
And
just cash flow.
Yeah, just for cash flow. So I'm trying to understand how this operates while the Federal Reserve says behind the scenes, they're trying to unload $5.5 trillion worth of their own debt into the open market. They barely can sell 30 billion or so in an open auction. And, there are these reporters who rank the sale, they grade them like A to E. And, how good was the sale of bonds? How aggressive were the buyers? Were they interested at these current interest rate levels or not? And sometimes they give it a C or a D and sometimes an A. And, if we're struggling just to sell the current amount of debt, how is the Federal Reserve going to try to unwind 400 billion more every month into the open market for the next year or two to do what they suggest they're going to try to do, which is unwind the $5.5 trillion they hold in bonds? I don't see how any of that is really possible.
How long do you tell people that they, because a lot of people want to buy gold and silver coins because they see it going up, right? And say, well, I want to buy it so I can, sell it in a year or so and make some money. What is the minimum time that you generally give people to buy numismatic coins before they think they might have to sell them?
Well, normally I look at this more as a hedge against inflation and protection of wealth more than a way of generating quick overnight returns.
Right.
So although sometimes the silver prices and gold prices get very exciting because they start jumping in price, I don't think the smart method is to try to speculate on short-term gains. I'm looking more for people to put money into gold and silver coins because my concern is, and I'm terrified, that people's wealth is being eroded without their recognition, but it does take time for inflation to chew away at money. I know Maria recommend a 4 or 5 year hold period or longer. Looking back, for example, when we were talking about the issues that occurred in the 90s, we were talking to people then and gold was $345 an ounce. And people were saying, well, when is it going to cross 400? I bought gold, it was 325 or 375, and it's, languishing here at 380 and 375. Is it going to ever get over 400? And now we sit with gold at 1850, 1870. We're pushing 1900 and 2000, and the debt was 5 trillion then. It's 30 plus trillion now. 10 years from now, it's going to increase much more rapidly. It's not going to take 20 years to go up as fast. It'll take a lot less time to grow more quickly. And I think we'll be at $50 trillion in debt within the next 10 years. And that means a massive increase in the amount of money that we're going to have to create. And that could push gold prices up 30, 40, 50%, 100% from where it is now easily. But I don't think this is something that people should buy today with the expectation of seeing massive growth in a month or, even 6 months, because we never know on a short-term basis what might happen. No markets, including gold and silver, go straight up. Like the US dollar doesn't go straight up or straight down. Since we were talking back in October and the dollar index had hit 115, I made the statement then that I believe we had seen the peak of the US dollar strength. Indicators to me were that it was going to start to slide in value against world currencies. Then it got down to as low as 101, and then we had a recovery this week to 103 because a great jobs number came out on Friday. So short-term economic events impact for a moment the strength
Makes
of the
the dollar
dollar
stronger.
against the world currency.
Yeah.
Gold goes down on the dollar going up. But the trend is the dollar is weakening, and the weaker it gets, the more expensive gold becomes. But I think this is a longer-term wealth protection process. It's great when short-term things happen and we make quick money, but I don't think that should be the expectation.
Long term. So, but there, nothing is for sure. But the scenario that you laid out with the amount of debt and could be 50 trillion and all that, it's a pretty safe.
It will be.
Yeah, pretty safe bet that gold and silver long term will go a lot higher than are today, right? I mean, nothing.
Well, sure.
I mean,
just
it
like
just
when we had
has
the
to, right?
conversation in the 90s when
Just
it was
has
3
to.
and 400, how will it be? And, if we end up with larger debt. And sure enough, as we had gamed it out then, we had never anticipated the numbers getting quite as large as they are. I think we'd only gone out to about 2015 or 2018 in our, expectations. And at that point, we were talking about an 18 or 19 trillion dollar national debt. And we thought that was incredible. And we knew that would drive the price of gold up 3 or 4 times. Well, sure enough, here we are now. Instead of the 18 trillion we thought, well, it did hit that, but then it surpassed it. Now we're at 30 trillion, and gold has gone from 350 to 1850 an ounce in the time frame. So the trend has continued, and it's going to continue that way because gold is denominated in the end in US dollars. The weaker the US dollar gets, the more expensive gold becomes. So for those people that are trying to hedge themselves against the progressively weaker dollar, it's great to accumulate physical assets in the form of gold and silver. Specifically coins, because of their fixed supply, will perform best. But again, I think this is something people absolutely need to have as a portion of their wealth going forward. because I think we have, as a country, I think Congress has abrogated its responsibility to the general public.
No, it's
We
just,
really should be pushing back on that a lot harder. They have a fiscal responsibility, but they take current money that we pay in taxes and they immediately turn it into bonds. So the money gets used right away to purchase debt, and now we have bonded debt that floats out there that we have to repay somewhere down the line. But I'm laughing at the fact that I've been around long enough. I'm at that point now in my life. I remember thinking of these things back in the late 90s, and we were worried about, when Treasury Secretary Rubin took the $3 trillion from Social Security and put it into debt in the form of bonds. And the idea was, well, we'll worry about it down the road. Well, here we are. We're down the road now. And there's been no resolution to the problem. It's gotten progressively worse. And at this point, with this deficit situation looming, where we have run out of money for 2 weeks now, the government has literally been out of money. They have stopped paying into the Government Services Administration's trust fund for the past 2 weeks because they don't have the money. And they're telling government employees, suck it up. Hopefully, Congress will raise the debt limit. But if they don't, well, we won't have the money in your pension account that you've been waiting for your whole life, working for, because the government has spent it, even though it was supposed to be in trust, specifically allocated for the purpose of your retirement. We felt compelled to take that money, use it, spend it on the promise that somehow we'll make good on it down the road. If Congress cannot get along, and Republicans were fairly clear last night, there are things they will not let happen. And they want
for the debt ceiling,
cuts.
for the debt ceiling thing. Yeah.
They want a lot of cuts.
Well,
in
they're
the
going to be able to
entitlement.
use this as leverage to get some stuff done if they've got some kind of conservative blood in their veins. You know what I mean?
So now we play chicken then with the economy.
Yeah.
That's what happens,
Yeah.
right?
Boy,
So the Democrats have made it very clear they will not touch Social Security or Medicaid. And apparently the Republicans agreed last night to some degree. But the Republicans want huge cuts in the entitlements, which are now about 64% of the federal budget. Unless they get that, they may not agree to raise the debt limit. And if we start having these problems, remember during the Obama administration, when we didn't have Congress agree to raising the debt limit, the credit ratings agencies downgraded U.S. government debt across the world. That raised interest rates. This is really a very difficult problem and dangerous for the U.S. dollar if the credit agencies look at this situation and say, these guys are like kids, they're children, they cannot play together. And if they can't agree to raising this debt limit and they start downgrading U.S. debt around the world, the U.S. dollar is in real trouble.
well, I think our listeners around the world that hear these shows and other shows are getting to the point where they understand that this whole thing is just screwed up and they're just not, it's not going to get well. So I guess I can't, other than buying gold and silver coins, which you recommend, that's what you do. What are some things that they can do to maybe weather whatever is going to happen in the next 2 or 3, 4 or 5 years? Is it to get out of debt for themselves? That this is something that they need to do?
Depending on how they're carrying the debt, I mean, the credit card debt in America has exploded.
Yeah, I know. I
Last couple of years.
saw the
Apparently,
numbers.
The numbers are in the trillions, and that's a little frightening that people are financing their life on their credit cards because the interest payments are insane if you don't make the payments on time. Look, the only thing I can think of is that if we can get people to hammer on their congressmen and senators to say, let's stop issuing bonds and start issuing notes instead. Just prevent the government from throwing debt out for 20 or 30 years and make them finance it on a short-term basis. Make them more obligated. Because the problem is that just like in the 90s, all the administrative choices that were made there came due now, 25, 30 years later, when all those people that made those decisions, they're not in Congress anymore. They're not facing the responsibility of their actions. They got away with it. They chose to deal with the problem at a short-term basis by throwing it down the road, kicking the can down the road, putting the debt on the backs of the children and grandchildren that would grow up after them. And by the time the recognition of the issue shows up, these people that are responsible, they're long gone. I think that's a very dangerous method because it allows them to get away with political things that I think the public wouldn't stand for if they dealt with it more frequently.
Fred,
So
I'd
like to see a shift to notes than bonds.
In shorter terms, what would prevent the inflation rate as prices rise, which we're experiencing now? What would prevent that from not just continuing up and up and up and up and up? I mean, Why would it stop? I'm trying to understand what would make it stop.
Well, remember, it's a relationship between the amount of money in circulation, the growth in the economy, and the prices of goods and services.
But that's going to have to go up with the painting the picture that what we know. They're going to have to increase the money supply. No doubt about it.
I would think so. I don't see any way around it.
So why would the inflation rate stop?
Well, I don't think it's going to stop. And this is the problem I think Chairman Powell is facing right now. I think he's recognizing, as he was speaking yesterday, that this inflation problem is not going away quickly. It's not going to be something that they're going to solve this month or next month or 6 months from now. It may slow down to some degree because there'll be fluctuations in the rate of inflation, but the actual inflation problem is not going anywhere.
So people can actually expect the milk and the meat and all the things we see rising, eggs and whatever, to keep going little by little. You don't see any reason why it would stop, really.
The only way that it will stop is if the economy starts growing so rapidly that the government's able to absorb enough of the additional money that they've created to slow down the gap between the amount of money floating through the economy and the growth in the economy.
Wow.
But the GDP ratio to that is upside down. You know, we think an inverted yield curve is dangerous. How about a GDP debt ratio that's about 123 to 1? So, you know, every dollar that we bring in, we spend $1.20. Even Jerome Powell has said this is, as his words are, unsustainable. You can't keep doing this indefinitely without facing a problem somewhere.
Did he say that?
And unfortunately,
Did he say that?
Yeah. And unfortunately, that somewhere is the cost to the general public of goods and services they're going to continue to have to buy. So are wages keeping up with the rate of inflation? Hardly.
No, but they will have to, right? Pressures. They're going to have to, or people will get angry, and that's going to cause more. So, wow.
It's a bad cycle.
Man, bad cycle. So just meat and potato stuff, would they raise the federal funds rate 50 basis points, right, to 5% yesterday, right?
25 basis points.
You sure? I thought they did 50.
I thought they did 25.
No? Okay. Well, I must have misread it. I thought they did 50 yesterday.
I could be wrong.
Or whatever. It doesn't matter. So tell folks what that means and what do they try to do. That's the amount of money that the banks have to pay to borrow, right? The Fed.
Sure. So continually, if you can increase the cost of borrowing money, you can slow an economy down. If you want to move an economy forward, make money cheap.
Right.
You know, make money cheap one way or the other. Now, here's the thing. The government not only was spending money it didn't have and deficit spending, and the economy wasn't growing fast enough, but the Federal Reserve took it upon itself not only to lower its key rates, its Fed funds rate and Fed discount rate, but it simultaneously also did, if you recall, quantitative easing, which was basically an economic tool that has the same impact as lowering interest rates. It makes liquidity more available. They pumped massive amounts of money into the economy through the process of quantitative easing that they are now looking to reverse. So simultaneously, the Fed is currently raising interest rates little by little and also looking to sell off its balance sheet, or what we would call quantitative tightening. Mm-hmm. So to try to liquidate now the bonds that they bought when they were quantitative easing also has the same impact as raising interest rates. It makes interest rates go up because it tightens the credit market. So if the Fed is going to try to unwind its balance sheet while raising interest rates, we're going to see interest rates continue to go up. The borrowing cost of money gets higher, and that squeezes down economic activity, because if the mortgage rate gets to 6% from 4%, it prices a lot of people out of those homes. If it costs more money to borrow to buy goods and services, people will not utilize the credit as much. Again, it's the opposite of making easy credit to drive an economy forward. You tighten credit to slow an economy down. Why in hell would they want to slow an economy down? Because the economy is running on hot inflation money that is filtering through the economy, making prices go up faster than wages. And that's creating a real big problem that the public is not happy with.
Yeah.
That is that cost of those eggs and bread and loaf, and the food that you mentioned. These are the impacts of the inflation showing up in the economy to a level the public is not happy.
For the thing that I think for me is really concerning, if you want to look at the big picture, wanting good things to happen, is that probably Americans don't understand what's going on. They've got no clue, right? I mean, there's no way
Well,
they
that's
would.
always been the case.
Yeah, I know, but there would be no way they'd understand that any of this is really going on, right? They watch the evening news. They don't see shows like this. We got a very boutique audience and other people that we have on. That's troubling, isn't it?
It is.
It's just
A lot of
crazy.
people that have money, though, are beginning to put it together because
Are
what
they?
they're experiencing is that, when you get a quarterly report from your investments and they're constantly going down and down and down, and people are saying, well, wait a minute, I just lost, 8% of my money or 12% of my money down this year and that year. I mean, after a while, people begin to recognize there's something happening that's not working and they start looking for alternatives. I think this is the rationale behind people's interest in all these various things like cryptos, for
Right.
example. I don't even think any of that interest would exist outside of some techno geeks if it weren't for the fact that people are thinking maybe I need an alternative to the US dollar. But I think that more people understand it now than they did 30 years ago, but still the number of people percentage-wise that get this is tiny.
Yeah,
It's really
I
tiny. And
think
it's
so.
a lot to understand, but I think it all harkens back to one very simple thing. We have a dollar in the U.S. that is totally unbacked. We print money that has no financial backing to it, and it is on the expectation of government's future revenue and ability to pay its debt that provides any kind of stability to the psychological strength in the dollar. That's why when credit agencies downgrade a world currency, it has a huge impact. It's a psychological gut punch. And we cannot experience too many of these gut punches when the US dollar is beginning to fade around the world anyway, as people look suspiciously at the ridiculous amount of debt we're carrying and whether or not we have the ability to make good on our obligations. God forbid the U.S. government defaults on any kind of bonded debt obligation because
That would be a
Congress doesn't raise the
disaster.
debt
That would be a
limit. It
disaster.
would absolutely be a disaster.
I don't think they're
that
ever
right.
going to let that happen, are they? They're never going to let that.
They've gotten close. And all we need is a couple of downgrades and we have trouble. So Congress needs to get its act together quickly. They need to put the bipartisan crap aside and realize, again, when we talk about this debt ceiling, this is money already spent. We're not arguing about whether or not government should add access to new money and how they should. This is money we've written the check for, floating through the mail. It's about to hit that account any day now. We have to make good on those obligations.
Just from your cheap seats there in the bleachers, Fred, do you think that there are enough people on the conservative end, and all politics is performance art, we know they're all the same, but enough to really make this whole debt ceiling thing to get something moving in the right direction? Do you think there's enough juice on their end?
Well, here's
to do
what
it?
happens. It's like a pressure cooker,
Uh-huh.
right? So the
kinda
longer you
build.
sit in there, the more the pressure builds up. And the more that they start pushing back and not agreeing, things start falling through the cracks. Okay, so right now, as we speak, the Treasury has already instituted what Janet Yellen is calling emergency measures,
I saw that.
which is she has stopped funding the Government Services Administration's trust fund. We're already starting to default on obligations, but these are things that are, okay, they're government employees. If I were a government employee and my government was telling me that pension account you've been paying into is defaulted and we're not making out good on our obligations, I would be tempted to sue the government for fiscal fiduciary irresponsibility, if we get a kind of outcry. Now, again, these are government employees, so they'll probably stand for it
Right.
a lot more than people who don't work for the federal government, who don't feel that obligation. So if this starts to affect the general public, the outcry is going to be enormous and overwhelming
Right.
and instantaneous.
Yeah. Andy used to talk about, and I actually have it in my screenplay, The Real World of Money, that the whole idea of means testing could be in the future of people where they would cut benefits to Social Security. Do you see any possibility of that in the future?
That's a political issue now. So now we're talking about, do they have the political gumption to say, look, we have to recognize that with a $77 trillion unfunded liability between these two accounts, perhaps it's time that we look at doing something. And of course, it's the third rail of politics. No one wants to tell seniors that their
You can't tell.
retirement account is subject to a political change. They're threatened by that. And that's a huge threat because there's tremendous political power behind the seniors in America. They are wealthy people. or a lot of cases, there's just a vast number of people that vote particularly one way in the political world, and you don't want to aggravate them by telling them that, your retirement is subject to change because politics has now dictated that we have a problem. And, I know you paid into it with good faith all those years, but guess what?
But guess what?
We don't have the money.
And
We
it's tough,
screwed up. So
and it's
you're
tough
not
to
going
win
to
an
get your
election.
retirement.
It's tough to win an election without Florida, And,
Yeah.
yeah.
So again, now we throw that into the mix, right? We're not quite there, but 2024 is an election year.
Yeah, you
we
bet.
have basically 1 year left. So I kind of got the hint last night in the State of the Union that, everybody seems to be on the same page that no one wants to touch the third rail.
Yeah.
So they're going to try to leave it alone. But I think at some point, means testing or some other method to address the problem, it just might become inevitable. I recognize in my 30s, I could not count on the idea that Social Security was going to be there for my retirement, and I began to make plans accordingly. I automatically, at that point in my life, said, I am not going to be so blindsided by obligations of the government, and that the fact that by the time I turn
30 years
65,
from
they're
now.
going to turn around and tell me, that they don't have the money. I kind of saw that coming, so I made retirement plans on my own. And I think individual Americans ought to do that themselves. Unfortunately, for some people, it's a little late. But for anybody that can still do this, it's the reason I advocate buying gold and silver coins as a long-term investment opportunity for people. It helps protect their long-term wealth, and at least they can provide themselves with some buying power going forward. Because if we end up with $50 trillion in debt in 10 years, what is a dollar going to buy?
True.
How much more will the price of gold and silver have been forced up by the difference between the value of paper money and gold and silver itself? It just seems inevitable that we have a problem. Unfortunately, like a bell curve, when they start going up, they tend to go up much more parabolic toward the end.
Right.
They go up much more quickly. The time span going left to right is reduced to near zero, but the increase in the amount of money and debt is increasing very, very rapidly.
Didn't that happen in the 70s where the huge rises in interest spiked there towards the end, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and it was ugly.
Yeah.
And, for some people who were positioned well, they made out like bandits.
Oh, because they purchased, they sold their gold.
$35 an ounce going to, 800 within a matter of 5 or 6 years. Yeah, I know people that retired on that movement in that 5 or 6 years, people that bought homes and people that put money away for their next generations of their family based on the profits they made because they were positioned right. And, again, I'm not speculating. I'm just thinking that wealth preservation is critical, and diversification out of paper money seems absolutely essential in this economic environment we're in.
Here's an email from Dennis in northern Utah. I live in Utah. He says, what does Fred think about Utah goldbacks? 3 other states, Nevada, Wyoming, and New Hampshire, have issued them as well. Is this the same as buying bullion?
It's similar, although you're not taking delivery of anything. You're getting something that is theoretically based upon the value of gold to some degree. I love this idea of anything that provides any kind of stability against the dollar. I'm a big fan of any kind of physical wealth, even though I'm not a fan of bullion because I don't like the regulations, and I think the intrinsic nature of the markets lean toward the pre-33 and pre-64 silver as a far better way to do it. I still believe that any physical form of wealth that people accumulate has got to be better than money. So when states like Utah and they issue a kind of a gold note, if you will, at least it's a pretense to try to say, listen, this has got to be better than just floating on back paper money. So it is similar to the bullion market in that it would only, of course, go up in value on 2 bases. 1, the price of the underlying metal goes up, or 2, for some reason there's actual demand for that currency in its actual form, greater than the available supplies of it.
I see more chatter around here and there about possible more state banks. States are looking into doing their own state banks, like North Dakota, right? And even and some are even talking about North Dakota is still in the Fed system. There are other states that want to do not even be in the Fed system, be public citizen banks. That would be pretty interesting.
Good luck with that.
You got to get the legislature to authorize that, right?
Yeah, that's going to be a tough battle. The Fed's not going to allow a lot of the banking institutions to exist outside of its umbrella. but I get it. And I think this is a really interesting idea for states to issue and have their own state banks.
Why not?
South Carolina, for example, we have massive amounts of money in the state that are held in New York. They're held by the big investment banking firms there. The funds that are held there pay interest there. A lot of that money could be deposited within the state and used accordingly. But I like the idea of the pushback. And I think these are people who
right?
thought this through and said, like you've brought up, are there any solutions to this? What can individual people do? So sometimes you get, and it would have to be a state like Utah. It would never be like New York or California.
Never going to happen.
Yeah. But you could get away with this in like Montana or Utah and say, well, we're going to have our own state bank, or we're going to issue a gold, because it'll be quiet for a while, and people think, well, it's just those people.
Because
up in those areas.
they could monetize debt just like other banks and just do the whole thing in their state. Also, there's a curious story out from Wyoming where they're passing legislation, and this is interesting, more 10th Amendment stuff, and they're stating real clearly, and DeSantis has talked about it, that the CDC and all these people in the World Health Organization, you have no jurisdiction over us whatsoever. You can do mandate, you can do all that stuff, but we ain't playing. And you're going to see more of that too. You're going to see more of that coming, where states are just going to, look at the 10th Amendment.
Well, I'm a big fan of, more state authority over federal.
You
Again,
bet.
I've like I said at the outset of the show, I'm a big fan of limited government to, the extent that we can get away with that. And I would rather see states have more authority than the federal government for a lot of issues, because at least it allows for more control within the state.
You can vote for your governor or
have
whatever.
somebody that they can see and they can hold responsible and, can possibly do some actions. But, my decades in this industry have taught me one thing: anybody who pushes back too hard is going to get squashed.
They send in the army, right, or whatever they're going to do. Yeah, they don't like being messed around with. Well, Fred, I know you got to go to a meeting. Thanks for being here. Tell folks.
Yeah, just a couple quick things for anybody who wants to buy.
Sure.
Today, the price of silver has drifted just a little bit because that incredibly large jobs number last Friday
Really?
did have an impact momentarily. It strengthened the dollar. And as I've said before, when the dollar goes up or down, it's never completely in one direction. It kind of ratchets. So we've had a little bit of a bounce back from the recent slide in the dollar, 101 on the index back to 103. It's going to start falling again. But in this temporary moment, while it's gone up a little bit because people were very enthused by the number of people that went back to work, silver has dropped just a little bit from about $24 down into the low 22s. I have silver quarters available right now for about the lowest premium we've had in about a year. So I have packages of silver coins available in the $2,000 to $5,000 range already put together. And then I have a couple of good deals on some of the standard $20 and $10 gold coins. So anybody who has some capital at this point, give us a call today, 800-878-2646. We can mix and match these things, but I think this is a great time for people to accumulate physical gold and silver.
So when silver goes down like that, you're able to factor that into your pricing right away? You're that flexible?
Absolutely.
Wow,
Yep.
That's cool.
Because still most of the value in silver quarters and dimes is
silver.
still in their metal content.
Yeah.
So it's amazing that we still look at silver quarters that have, roughly $4 worth of silver that you can buy for under $6. It's a phenomenal area to be able to buy physical assets that have such a low premium over melt value.
Yeah, kind of fun. And, there's so many silver monsters out there that have been looking for silver to really make a big move. Do you think we're going to ever see that before you go? Will we ever see it really, wake up one morning and it's $50 or $100 or something?
Yeah, I do. Because all it'll take is one exogenous event, and that'll be it.
Yeah.
I mean, the market supplies are so tight. Look, last year we saw a single transaction rock the market for 90 days, almost 3.5 months. One transaction of $50 million was enough to create shortages in supply chains of the silver coins across the United States that lasted for, it was almost 3 months. I mean, any large amounts of purchases that start to venture into this area are going to wipe out supplies in a heartbeat. And the price of silver could easily escalate. Any loss of faith in the U.S. dollar, listen, when silver was $4 an ounce in the 1990s, we talked about that, one day we might see $10, $20 silver. Well, it's, about 23, 24 now. And again, to see $100 silver in the next decade, I don't think that is unprecedented at all.
What caused it to do that? It did a $50 deal some years ago. What was that about? Do you remember?
Well,
What was
yeah.
it? What was
Uh,
it?
real options and futures contracts trading simultaneously cornered the market. It was
Uh-huh.
sort of like a Hunt Brothers scenario where you had massive amounts of money that took control of both the long-term option contracts and try to buy all the physical silver simultaneously. And the rush and the short-term demand was so exacerbated that it just spiked the price
Wow.
right through the roof because, once we hit that shortage, it becomes a scramble. If I'm getting orders from people and they're saying, okay, here's $100,000, I want to buy silver, and I'm out, and the wholesalers are telling me they'll provide it to me, but they're going to want X much more, I'm probably going to pay that X much more. And if I have to then jump on top of that for the next order, I'm going to do that to fill the orders, as will every other dealer. And the next thing you know, everybody's chasing the market, and there just wasn't enough supply quickly enough
Yeah.
to meet the demands. It just shows you how quickly
Yeah.
that dynamic can impact the price. So it could happen at any time. But again, I think the investors ought to look at the long term. You keep that in your back pocket that, hey, there could be a spike at any point for any given moment. But again, let's play it the long term smart play, which is just wealth protection.
Yeah.
If that happens, great. But if not, we're not going to be disappointed.
And on that 50, when it did that, how long did it take it to drop back down to where it was? Do you remember?
Didn't take long. Just, took a couple months.
Yeah, and it just
It began to drip pretty quickly.
slowly went.
Yeah.
All right, kiddo. Thanks.
Spikes like that,
Yeah.
they should come down about as fast as they go up.
Thanks for being here. Spring is coming to Hilton Head, so that's good.
It is. It's right around the corner. We almost have our green wind, which is this strange little phenomenon we get here every spring. We get this sort of dusting of pollen that comes off of the
Oh,
local
good.
foliage, and it turns the wind green, and it leaves this green dust all over your automobiles and houses and driveways and things. You just wake up with this sort of dusting of green. It's interesting, but it's an indicator spring is coming, and we saw the first of that this week. So we're right around the corner from a beautiful spring.
What fun. Thanks, Fred. Take care of yourself. We'll see you real soon. Let us know if we can help.
Be well, Patrick.
Bye-bye. Fred Zashesky, The Real World of Money, and we're going to give you his phone number again before we leave here. It's 800-878-2646.